In 1946, the Harlem River was more than just a waterway, it was a graveyard for secrets. But for 3 days in June, those secrets refused to stay buried. They say justice is blind, but in Jim Crow New York, justice was also deaf and heartless. When 18-year-old Ruby Williams was found discarded in a railroad yard, the police didn't see a National Honor Society student or a future teacher. They saw a colored female and a closed file. They called her a prostitute to avoid doing their jobs. But they forgot one thing: Ruby Williams had a father, and her father had a childhood friend named Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. June 4, 1946, 2:38 a.m. Marcus Williams sat at his kitchen table, the yellow light of a single bulb reflecting off the cold steel of a .38 revolver. He had $47 worth of pawnshop iron in his hand and a hollow where his heart used to be. His daughter, Ruby, the girl who read books every night, the girl with a full scholarship to Howard University, was gone. The police had insulted her memory before her body was even cold. Marcus was prepared to die for revenge. He was going to hunt her killers until his last breath. But his wife, Evelyn, destroyed by grief, gripped his arm. "You'll take that gun and you'll die, Mark," she sobbed, "and Ruby's killers will still be walking free." "Then what do I do, Evelyn?" Marcus roared. "Call him," she whispered. "Call Bumpy." Marcus dialed a number he had spent 10 years trying to forget. The phone rang 3 times. "Mark," the voice answered. Bumpy knew who it was before a word was spoken. "Bump, they killed my Ruby." There was a 5-second silence that felt like a century. Then a voice as cold as a January grave replied, "I'm coming." To understand the blood that was about to flow, you have to understand the predators. Tony Russo and his crew, Polly, Jimmy, Vinny, and Frank, were bottom feeders for the Genovese family. They were enforcers who had discovered a dark, sick sport, hunting young black girls. They had killed before Dorothy Jenkins in '45, and the police had done nothing. They learned a terrible lesson: you could destroy these girls and the system would help you hide the bodies. On June 3rd, they saw Ruby Williams in her yellow summer dress carrying library books and a Bible. They grabbed her in broad daylight on Lenox Avenue. They took her to a warehouse in the South Bronx. What happened over the next 3 hours is too evil for words. When they were done, they wrapped her in canvas and dumped her behind a trash heap. They went to a bar to celebrate. They thought they were safe. They didn't know that Bumpy Johnson was already standing in their shadows. By Tuesday morning, Bumpy was sitting in a back office in Little Italy with Frank Costello, the prime minister of the mob. Bumpy didn't come with threats, he came with a reality check. "Your people killed a girl in my territory," Bumpy said, his eyes fixed on Costello. "They're liabilities, they're animals, and I'm going to kill every one of them. The only question is, are you going to stand in my way?" Costello, a businessman who hated messy crimes, looked at the floor. He knew Bumpy was right. "These 5 crossed a line that shouldn't exist," Costello replied. "They are no longer under my protection. Handle your business, Bumpy, just keep it clean." Bumpy walked out with 5 names, 5 addresses, and a license to deliver a nightmare. Thursday, 11:30 p.m. Tony Russo left a bar, drunk on his own perceived invincibility. A shot rang out, shattering his kneecap. He was dragged into a car and taken to the same warehouse where he had tortured Ruby. Bumpy showed him Ruby's graduation photo. "You recognize her?" Tony begged for his life, offering to confess. Bumpy just opened a briefcase filled with pliers, a hammer, and wire cutters. "The courts won't convict you, Tony, but I will." For 4 hours, Tony Russo felt everything Ruby had felt. At 4:15 a.m., his body hit the Harlem River. Friday, 1:00 a.m., Polly and Jimmy were ambushed leaving a card game. They woke up in a soundproof basement facing each other. Bumpy sat between them. "You two were the grabbers," he said. He watched as his men used bolt cutters on their fingers one by one, 10 fingers for 10 years of the life they stole from Ruby. They begged for death, but Bumpy made them wait 6 hours for the privilege. Friday, 4:00 p.m. Vinnie Carbone, the man who held the chloroform, was taken next. By 7:00 p.m. he was dead. By 8:00 p.m. he was in the river at 135th Street. The air inside St. Jude was thick with the scent of unburnt beeswax and the cold metallic tang of old stone. Frank Russo, the youngest of the Russo clan, didn't look like a feared enforcer anymore. At 22 he looked like a boy wearing his father's oversized suit. His lungs burned, each breath a jagged shard of glass, a reminder of the 6 blocks he'd sprinted through the biting Bronx wind. He hadn't come for salvation, he had come for a hiding spot. but as he reached the front pew his legs gave out. The silence of the sanctuary was heavier than the noise of the street and it crushed him. He collapsed onto the velvet kneeling cushion, his forehead resting against the cold wood of the altar rail. "Please, God," Frank whispered, his voice cracking. "Please, I didn't want any of it. It was Tony's idea. I just drove the car. Please save me." He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to remember the prayers his grandmother had whispered over him when he was a child in Naples. The words were gone, replaced by the vivid, screaming memory of Ruby Williams. He could still see the way the streetlights caught the gold trim of her book bag as she crossed the street, the girl who wanted to be a teacher, whose life they had snuffed out for a message that didn't even matter anymore. The shadow in the sanctuary. The heavy oak doors at the rear of the church didn't creak. They simply breathed open, admitting a gust of winter air that made the candle flames dance in their red glass holders. Frank didn't turn around. He didn't have to. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. A slow, rhythmic footfall echoed against the marble floor. Tap, 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 the sound of a polished cane hitting the stone. "God's not listening, Frank," a voice smooth as aged bourbon echoed through the rafters. "He's a busy man and he's heard enough lies for one evening." Frank's entire body seized. He didn't move as the shadow stretched over the altar, eclipsing the golden crucifix. Bumpy Johnson stepped into the light of the votive candles. He looked impeccable, a charcoal overcoat, a silk scarf, and eyes that held the weight of 100 Harlem winters. "Mr. Johnson," Frank sobbed, finally turning. He stayed on his knees, hands clasped in a parody of devotion. "Please, I'm just a kid. Tony made me do it." Bumpy looked around the vaulted ceiling, his expression unreadable. "You're old enough to pull a trigger, Frank. That means you're old enough to meet the consequences. But stand up. This is a house of God, and I won't have you staining the floor with cowardice." The dad on the steps. Bumpy reached down, his hand surprisingly gentle as he gripped Frank's collar. He hauled the boy to his feet with a strength that belied his age. He didn't strike him. He didn't pull a weapon. He simply walked him toward the exit, his hand firm on the back of Frank's neck. "Why are we going outside?" Frank whimpered, his heels dragging against the aisle carpet. "Because," Bumpy said softly, "even a man like me has rules. I don't spill blood where people come to find peace. But the world outside, the world where Ruby lived, that world is mine." They emerged onto the wide stone steps of the church. The Bronx was quiet, the street lamps casting long, skeletal shadows across the pavement. The cold hit Frank like a physical blow, snapping him out of his hysterics into a dull, hollow dread. Bumpy reached into his inner coat pocket and pulled out a small, rectangular piece of cardstock. It was white, pristine, and featured elegant calligraphy that looked like an invitation to a high society gala. He held it up to Frank's face. "Do you know what this says, Frank?" Frank blinked through his tears, the words blurring. I can't." "It says, Ruby Williams, she wanted to be a teacher. Harlem remembers." Bumpy's voice was no longer smooth. It was a low growl that vibrated in the chilly air. "I've pinned one of these to your brother Tony. I pinned one to Sal. I pinned one to Vinny and Polly. You're the last of the set, Frank," the punctuation mark at the end of a very ugly sentence. "The weight of a name." Bumpy let go of the boy's collar and stepped back, smoothing the lapels of his own coat. He looked out at the empty street, his silhouette tall and imposing against the church's Gothic arches. "You lot thought Harlem was a playground," Bumpy mused, almost to himself. "You thought you could take a light out of that neighborhood and nobody would notice because the neighborhood is dark. But you forgot one thing, I am the one who keeps the lights on." Frank looked at the street, then back at the silent, closed doors of the church. He realized then that the final prayer wasn't for his life, it was for his soul. Bumpy wasn't just an executioner, he was a bookkeeper and the ledgers had to be balanced. "Tell me," Bumpy asked, his eyes locking onto Frank's one last time. "In all those years of school, did you ever learn what happens to a debt that goes unpaid?" Frank couldn't answer, his throat had closed up. "It gathers interest," Bumpy whispered. He reached into his pocket for the heavy silver piece he carried, not a gun, but the tool of a man who wanted his work to be felt. He stepped forward, the note pinned firmly between his fingers, ready to finish the tally. The Bronx remained silent, the only sound the distant siren of an ambulance that would eventually be called for the last of the Russo brothers. On Sunday morning, the sun rose over a city in shock. 5 bodies had floated to the surface of the Harlem River at 5 different locations. Each one bore the same note, each one had been systematically dismantled. The police arrived, looked at the notes, and looked at the names of the dead men. They remembered the prostitution report they had filed for Ruby Williams. They knew that to investigate these murders was to admit their own corruption and failure. So they did exactly what Bumpy knew they would do. They looked away. They called it gang violence and closed the files. Ruby Williams was buried on June 15th at Woodlawn Cemetery. Bumpy Johnson stood in the back, silent and stoic. Marcus and Evelyn Williams didn't have their daughter back, but for the first time in 2 weeks they could sleep. The Harlem River ran red for 3 days so that the children of Harlem could walk in the sun for the next 20 years. Bumpy Johnson proved that when the law fails the people have a king who doesn't. Harlem remembers, and the river never lies.